There's a stage that comes after the breaking point most people talk about, after the door slam, after the withdrawal, after the dramatic internal shift everyone focuses on when they discuss what happens to an empath who's finally had enough. But almost nobody talks about what comes after that stage, the quiet, settled place an empath actually lands in once the storm of finally reaching their limit has passed. Today we're talking about that final stage specifically, not the breaking, but what an empath actually becomes once the breaking is long behind them. Because it looks nothing like what anyone expects, and it explains behavior in seasoned, deeply healed empaths that confuses almost everyone who's only ever encountered the earlier, more exhausted version of them. Let's establish something important before we go further, because this distinction is the entire foundation of this episode. There's a real difference between an empath who has recently reached their limit and an empath who has lived on the other side of that limit for years. The recently limited empath is often still raw, understandably guarded, sometimes overcorrecting, occasionally still carrying residual anger from everything that led them there. This stage gets discussed constantly in psychology content because it's dramatic, visible, and relatively easy to describe. What almost nobody discusses is the stage that comes after that rawness settles. A genuinely final form this pattern takes, once enough time and enough deliberate internal work has passed, that the empath is no longer reacting to what happened. They've simply permanently become someone different because of it. Here's the first characteristic of this final stage, and it surprises people who only know the earlier, more reactive version of a wounded empath, an almost complete absence of urgency around being believed. In earlier stages of setting boundaries, reclaiming self-respect, or processing hurt, there's often a real, felt need to have your experience validated by the person who hurt you, by mutual friends, by anyone willing to confirm that what happened, happened, and that your response to it was reasonable. In this final stage, that need has genuinely, quietly dissolved. Not because the empath has become detached from their own feelings, but because their relationship to truth has changed at a fundamental level. They no longer need external agreement in order to fully trust their own account of what occurred. This isn't coldness. It's the end point of an enormously long internal process of learning to be their own witness, rather than requiring someone else to serve that function for them. The second characteristic, a genuinely reduced startle response to behavior that would have once produced significant emotional reactivity. This is different from the numbness that sometimes shows up in the immediate aftermath of a breaking point, where reduced reaction can actually reflect exhaustion or dissociation rather than health. In this final stage, the reduced reactivity comes from somewhere much more solid, an empath who has, over years, built such an accurate internal model of certain behavioral patterns that very little actually surprises them anymore, and things that don't surprise you simply don't produce the same spike of adrenaline, anger, or hurt that novel threats do. Someone in this stage can watch a manipulative tactic unfold in real time, recognize exactly what it is within seconds, and respond with something closer to mild, almost professional interest than any genuine emotional disturbance. The way a doctor who's seen a particular symptom 1,000 times doesn't panic at the 1,001st presentation of it. The third characteristic, and one of the more counterintuitive ones, a renewed, expansive capacity for generosity that looks, on the surface, remarkably similar to the boundless giving that got them hurt in the first place, but that operates on completely different internal machinery underneath. This confuses people who've read a lot of content warning empaths against overgiving, because it seems to suggest the goal is permanent restriction, permanent guardedness, a smaller, more protected version of generosity forever. But that's not actually what the final stage looks like in practice. An empath who has genuinely done the work, processed the hurt, built real discernment, developed a stable internal sense of worth, often becomes remarkably generous again, sometimes even more generous than they were before everything happened. The difference isn't in the quantity of generosity, it's in its source. Earlier, generosity came from fear, from a need to be needed, from an inability to tolerate someone else's disappointment. Final stage generosity comes from genuine abundance, freely chosen, offered specifically because the person offering it has enough internal stability to give without it costing them anything essential, and without any expectation that giving guarantees anything in return. The fourth characteristic, an ability to hold deep compassion for someone's suffering while remaining completely unmoved regarding whether to re-engage with them. This is one of the more sophisticated developments of this final stage because it requires two things that seem, at first glance, contradictory: genuine warmth toward another person's pain and complete indifference to whether that pain changes the empath's own decisions about proximity or access. Earlier in an empath's development, compassion and re-engagement were often fused together. Feeling bad for someone almost automatically produced an impulse to help, to reconnect, to give them another chance. In this final stage, that fusion has come apart entirely. An empath at this stage can genuinely feel sorrow for someone's difficult life, their unprocessed trauma, their obvious suffering, and simultaneously feel absolutely no pull toward reopening a door that closed for good reasons. This isn't a contradiction. It's actually one of the healthiest developments possible because it means compassion no longer functions as a vulnerability that others can exploit by performing suffering in front of them. The fifth characteristic, and one of the quieter but most important ones, an almost complete disinterest in narratives, theirs, other people's, the story being told about what happened in any given relationship or conflict. Earlier stages of processing hurt often involve intense investment in narrative, in making sure the correct version of events gets told, remembered, believed. In this final stage, that investment largely dissolves, not because the truth stopped mattering, but because the empath's sense of self no longer depends on a particular story winning out in the eyes of anyone else. They know what happened. That knowledge is stable, internal, settled. Whether anyone else's version of events matches it, or whether some people continue believing a distorted account, simply stops generating the same charge it once did, because the empath's peace was never actually contingent on universal agreement about the facts. The sixth characteristic, and this is the one that ties everything else together into something coherent, a genuinely expanded, almost paradoxical sense of safety in the world. Despite having been hurt badly enough at some point to reach the breaking point that got them here in the first place. This seems, on its face, like it shouldn't make sense. Shouldn't real, significant hurt produce more caution, more guardedness, a smaller sense of what's safe rather than a larger one? But this is exactly the counterintuitive truth of this final stage. Having survived and metabolized a genuine breaking point, rather than avoided or suppressed it, tends to produce someone who trusts their own capacity to handle whatever comes next far more than they did before any of it happened. The safety isn't coming from the world being less dangerous. It's coming from the empath finally, fully trusting their own ability to recognize danger accurately and respond to it appropriately, rather than depending on the world itself to simply never present any danger at all. I want to talk about what this actually looks like in someone's daily life, because abstract descriptions of psychological stages can be hard to picture concretely. An empath in this final stage tends to move through difficult conversations with a kind of settled ease that people who knew them earlier often find almost unrecognizable. They can hear criticism without either collapsing into it or immediately deflecting it, simply holding it, considering it, taking what's useful and setting aside what isn't, without needing the conversation to resolve in any particular direction in order to feel okay afterward. They can watch someone attempt an old manipulation tactic and respond with something close to genuine warmth, not because they've been fooled, but because they've become so secure in their own perception that the attempt itself doesn't threaten them, the way a skilled swimmer doesn't panic at the sight of deep water the way a beginner does. They can say no to something without any accompanying guilt spiral, and they can say yes to something generously, without any hidden resentment building underneath the surface, because the yes was genuinely chosen rather than extracted through fear. I want to be honest about something important here, because this entire episode could easily be read as suggesting this final stage arrives automatically, given enough time. It doesn't. Plenty of people experience a genuine breaking point and never actually move through it into this settled, final form, instead getting stuck somewhere in the earlier, more reactive stages indefinitely, sometimes for the rest of their lives, carrying permanent guardedness, permanent suspicion, permanent reactivity that never actually resolves into the kind of stable, discerning generosity we've described today. The difference between reaching this final stage and remaining stuck somewhere earlier isn't simply the passage of time. It requires something much more specific and much more deliberate. And that's exactly where we're headed in the second half of this conversation. What actually needs to happen internally and practically to move from the raw, reactive aftermath of a breaking point into this settled final stage that so few people ever discuss, and why understanding the specific mechanism that produces this shift might be the single most important thing an empath can learn about their own long-term healing. Let's talk about what actually needs to happen to move from the raw, reactive aftermath of a breaking point into this settled final stage, because understanding the specific mechanism matters far more than simply waiting for time to do the work on its own. The first requirement, and it's more specific than people expect, a genuine completed grieving process, rather than a grief that gets managed indefinitely without ever actually resolving. This distinction matters enormously because a lot of people confuse ongoing vigilance with unresolved grief, assuming that if they're still occasionally triggered, still occasionally guarded, they haven't actually finished grieving what happened. But completed grief doesn't mean the absence of any residual feeling. We talked about this in an earlier episode, the way old waves can still occasionally roll through even years later. Completed grief means the story has actually reached an ending internally rather than remaining perpetually open, perpetually being relitigated, perpetually requiring new evidence or new understanding before it can finally be filed away as something that happened, was survived, and no longer requires active processing on a daily basis. Many people get stuck in the earlier stages specifically because they never actually let the grief conclude. They keep the wound perpetually fresh, sometimes unconsciously, because a wound that's still open still feels, in a strange way, like unfinished business that might still resolve differently if enough energy keeps getting poured into it. The second requirement is what I'd call earned trust in your own perception, built specifically through repeated, verified accuracy over time, rather than simply declared through willpower. This is one of the most overlooked ingredients in reaching the final stage, because a lot of people try to shortcut directly to, "I trust my own judgment now," without actually accumulating the evidence that would make that trust genuinely earned rather than simply asserted. The empaths who actually reach this final stage tend to have spent real time, often years, testing their own read on situations against what actually unfolded afterward. Noticing when their instinct about someone turned out to be accurate, noticing when it didn't, refining the internal model gradually through actual feedback rather than assuming perfect accuracy from the very beginning. This process can't be rushed because trust built on evidence is fundamentally different from trust simply declared as a coping mechanism, and only the former tends to hold up reliably under real pressure. The third requirement, and this one is often the hardest to actually practice, repeated exposure to situations that test the new boundaries, survived successfully again and again, until the new pattern becomes the default rather than something requiring conscious effort every single time. This connects to something we discussed in an earlier episode about the discipline required to sustain healthy shifts. Every time an old guilt trip surfaces and gets recognized and released without derailing the person, every time a boundary gets tested and holds, every time generosity gets offered freely, without any accompanying resentment building up underneath, the new pattern gets reinforced a little more deeply. This is not a single decision made once. It's hundreds, sometimes thousands, of small repetitions, each one adding weight to a new default that eventually becomes as automatic as the old, more reactive pattern once was. The fourth requirement, and one that surprises people because it seems to run against everything we associate with healing, continued willingness to be occasionally wrong, occasionally fooled, occasionally hurt again in smaller ways, without that occasional pain undoing the entire structure that's been built. This is crucial because a lot of people, in trying to protect themselves from ever experiencing anything like their original breaking point again, build increasingly rigid, increasingly comprehensive defenses that actually prevent them from ever reaching this final stage at all. Real safety, the kind that produces the settled ease we described in the first half of this episode, doesn't come from eliminating every possible future risk. It comes from developing genuine confidence in your own capacity to recover from occasional smaller hurts without them ever again escalating into the kind of prolonged, exhausting depletion that led to the original breaking point. Someone in the final stage isn't invulnerable. They've simply proven to themselves, through actual lived experience, that even when something does go wrong, they can handle it without it costing them everything they've built. The fifth requirement, and maybe the most subtle, a willingness to let go of the story of yourself as someone who was hurt, in favor of a story of yourself as someone who has simply, factually, grown. This distinction matters more than it might initially seem, because identity built around the hurt itself. I'm someone who was betrayed, who was taken advantage of, who had to learn the hard way. Keeps a person perpetually oriented backward toward the original wound, even after significant healing has actually occurred. Identity built around growth instead. I'm someone who has become genuinely discerning, genuinely stable, genuinely capable of both compassion and boundaries, orients a person forward toward who they've actually become, rather than backward toward what was done to them. This shift in self-narrative isn't just semantic. It changes what actually gets reinforced every time the story gets told, internally or to other people. And people who remain oriented around their original hurt, even years later, often find themselves unable to fully arrive at this final stage, precisely because their own internal story keeps recentering the wound rather than the growth that came after it. I want to say something important about what this final stage actually offers the world, beyond just the individual empath's own peace, because I think it's easy to frame all of this as purely personal, purely about one person's healing, when actually, this stage produces something genuinely valuable for everyone lucky enough to be in relationship with someone who's reached it. An empath in this final stage becomes, for the people around them, one of the rarest and most valuable presences available, someone whose compassion is genuine rather than compulsive, whose boundaries are stable rather than reactive, whose generosity comes from actual abundance rather than fear, and whose perception of other people is sharp enough to protect both themselves and, often, the people they love from patterns that would otherwise go unrecognized until real damage had already occurred. This is, in many ways, the actual gift hidden inside the entire painful arc we've discussed across this series. Not that the hurt was worth it, but that what eventually gets built on the other side of it, when the process is allowed to complete rather than being rushed, avoided, or permanently arrested in its earlier stages, becomes something genuinely rare and genuinely valuable, both for the person who built it and for everyone fortunate enough to receive it. I want to leave you with an image because I think it captures everything we've walked through today across both halves of this episode better than any explanation could. Picture a river somewhere far upstream, moving fast and violent through a narrow, jagged canyon, the kind of water that carves stone simply by refusing to stop moving, crashing against rock after rock, forced into whatever narrow, chaotic path the landscape allows it, with no room to slow down, no room to settle, no room to do anything except keep pushing forward through whatever obstacle happens to be directly in its way. This is the river during the breaking point and during the raw, reactive stage that follows it, full of real force, real necessary energy, but shaped entirely by whatever crisis it happens to be moving through in that specific moment. But follow that same river far enough downstream, past the canyon, out into open, level country, and something remarkable has happened to the exact same water that used to crash so violently against those narrow stone walls. It's widened, it's slowed, just enough to reflect the sky clearly on its surface instead of churning it into constant white water. It moves now with a kind of unhurried, powerful patience, still carrying the same volume, the same fundamental force it always had, but no longer needing to prove that force by crashing against everything in its path. It simply moves steadily toward wherever it's actually going, carving its banks now, not through violent collision, but through the quiet, accumulated patience of water that knows, with complete certainty, exactly what it is and exactly where it's headed. Boats can rest on a river like this. Villages get built along its banks, trusting its steadiness in a way nobody would ever trust the violent water still churning through that narrow canyon far upstream. And here's what's easy to forget. Looking at this wide, calm, powerful river moving peacefully through open country. This is the exact same water that once crashed through solid rock with enough force to carve an entire canyon. The power was never in question, not even during the most violent, chaotic upstream years. What changed was simply the shape it was finally given enough room to take, once it had traveled far enough beyond the narrow crisis that first forced it into that jagged, difficult path. That is what this final stage actually is, not the absence of everything that came before it. The full, complete arrival of everything that came before it, finally given enough time, enough room, enough patient work to become something a person can build an entire, peaceful life around, steady enough to be trusted, deep enough to still carry real force, and calm enough, finally, to simply move forward, exactly the way it was always capable of moving, long before anyone ever forced it through that narrow, violent canyon in the first place.